They called it Operation Bernhard, a secret buried deep within the heart of the Third Reich, a plan so bold it could have rewritten the world's economy. Behind barbed wire and watchtowers, prisoners forged what no army could defeat: money. Perfect British banknotes, millions of them. Enough to flood an empire. Enough to destroy it. If you believe these stories and the ones they tried to erase should never be forgotten, subscribe now. Because what began as a weapon of deception ended up devouring the very regime that created it. But how did a stack of counterfeit pounds become the currency that destroyed Nazi Germany? Berlin, April 1945. The air is thick with smoke. Buildings sag like broken teeth against a grey sky. Soviet artillery pounds the city in a rhythm that rattles glass and bone alike. Somewhere in the ruins of a half-collapsed vault, piles of crisp banknotes lie scattered across the floor, millions of pounds sterling. Each note flawless, each note worthless. A German officer stares at them, then lets them fall from his hands like confetti. He doesn't even bother to pick them up. Out on the street, starving civilians barter with cigarettes, potatoes, or whatever scraps they can find. Paper money means nothing now. In these final days, the Nazi Reich is drowning not only in fire and blood, but in lies of its own making. Lies printed on counterfeit currency, on hollow economic promises, on the very Reichsmark that once fueled Hitler's war machine. The strange truth is this: Nazi Germany didn't just lose the war in the skies above Berlin or the trenches of the Eastern Front. It lost it in its currency, real and symbolic, because in the end, the Reich tried to counterfeit not just money, but its own survival. Here's the question: can a nation lose a world war because of money? We remember tanks, bombers, generals. We picture Stalingrad's frozen hell, the beaches of Normandy, the burning cities. But behind all that steel and blood was something quieter, something just as decisive: currency. Nazi Germany's war machine was built on a fragile illusion, a Reichsmark propped up by debt, plunder, and propaganda. Hitler called it a miracle economy. In reality, it was a time bomb. And when that illusion cracked, it wasn't just the battlefield that collapsed. It was the very foundation of the Reich. And then there's the strangest chapter of all: Operation Bernhard, the Nazi plot to counterfeit Britain's currency on an industrial scale. A secret operation that forced Jewish prisoners in Sachsenhausen concentration camp to produce perfect forgeries of the British pound, a weapon of financial mass destruction. The Nazis dreamed of crashing the British economy by flooding it with fake money. But here's the irony. In trying to weaponize currency, they revealed the deep sickness at the heart of their own. This story isn't just about paper and ink. It's about trust. The trust in a currency, in a government, in an idea. And once that trust is spent, no army, no fortress, no dictator can save a nation. Over the next hour, we're going to follow that story. From the fragile Reichsmark of the 1930s, to the prisoners forced to counterfeit Britain's wealth, to the front lines where cigarettes and bread became the only currency that mattered, and finally, to the ruins of Berlin, where a regime bankrupt in every sense collapsed under its own weight. This is the story of the currency that destroyed Nazi Germany. Long before the tanks rolled into Poland, before the swastika banners hung over Paris, Hitler's empire was already fighting a different kind of war, a war of numbers. Germany in the 1930s looked on the surface like a nation reborn. After the chaos of Weimar inflation, when wheelbarrows of paper money bought a single loaf of bread, the Reich under Hitler projected strength and order. Unemployment plummeted. New autobahns carved through the countryside. Factories roared to life, pouring out steel, weapons, and concrete for the future Hitler promised. To the world it looked like a miracle, but it wasn't. Behind the posters and parades, the Nazi economy was a shell game. The Reichsmark, Germany's official currency, was already unstable, propped up by tricks that couldn't last. The architect of this illusion was Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reichsbank, a banker who knew how to conjure wealth out of thin air. Schacht invented something called the Mefo bill. It was a financial sleight of hand. The government would pay for weapons and industry with promissory notes, IOUs disguised as private company bonds. Factories got paid, workers got their wages, tanks rolled off assembly lines. But behind it all there was no real money. It was debt layered on debt. By 1938, Germany was swimming in these hidden obligations. The Reichsmark still carried the illusion of stability, but it was already backed by nothing solid. The entire Nazi economy rested on the gamble that conquest would solve the problem, that plundered gold, stolen resources, and occupied nations would pay for Hitler's dreams. And so, the Reichsmark wasn't really a currency in the traditional sense. It was a time bomb, set to detonate the moment expansion slowed. But Hitler didn't care. He wasn't interested in balanced ledgers or sober economics. He was interested in speed, in momentum, in power. As long as the illusion held, the Reich looked unstoppable. Inside Germany, propaganda painted a glowing picture. The worker with steady wages, the housewife with food on the table, the soldier with his pay in Reichsmarks. But beneath it all was fragility. The Reichsmark only worked because people believed it worked, and belief once broken cannot be rebuilt by force. The irony is stark. The same nation that remembered the humiliation of Weimar hyperinflation now charged headlong into another system just as unstable. The German people trusted the Reichsmark because they wanted to believe in the Reich itself. But trust is a currency too, and Hitler was spending it recklessly. By the time the first bombs fell in 1939, the Reichsmark was already bleeding. Rearmament had drained resources. Imports of critical raw materials, oil, rubber, grain, were bought on credit the Reich could not repay. The German economy was not ready for a long war. It was ready for a short, victorious lightning strike, blitzkrieg. And when that failed to deliver final victory, when the war dragged on year after year, the cracks widened. Inflation loomed. Black markets thrived. Civilians hoarded goods, not marks. Soldiers abroad found their wages worthless compared to cigarettes, chocolate, or Allied dollars. The Reichsmark, once paraded as the symbol of German rebirth, was already betraying the regime from within. This was the foundation on which Operation Bernhard, the great counterfeiting plot, would later sit. A regime that had built its empire on financial illusions would try to weaponize financial illusion itself. But before that story unfolds, we have to meet the men who engineered it, the bankers, the SS officers, and the prisoners whose lives would be bound to one of the strangest operations of the entire war. Every empire of conquest hides its accountants. Behind Hitler's roaring speeches and the parades of steel, there were men in dark suits shuffling papers, signing orders, and quietly feeding the Reich's hunger for war. At the center was Hjalmar Schacht, the magician banker. A tall aristocratic man with sharp features and a sharper mind, Schacht had once rescued Germany from the nightmare of Weimar hyperinflation. For that he earned respect both at home and abroad. When Hitler came to power, Schacht joined him, not because he was a rabid Nazi, but because he saw in Hitler a chance to restore German pride, and in himself, the man to bankroll it. Schacht engineered the Mefo bill scheme that kept factories alive without real money. But he was a pragmatist, not a fanatic. By the late 1930s, as Hitler's appetite grew insatiable, Schacht warned, "This economic house of cards cannot last." He pushed for limits. Hitler despised limits. Their relationship soured. By 1939, Schacht was sidelined. Into his place stepped Walter Funk, a loyal Nazi with none of Schacht's brilliance. Funk had once been a journalist, then Goebbels' press secretary, and finally Minister of Economics. Where Schacht saw danger, Funk saw opportunity to please his Führer. He opened the Reichsbank's vaults to the SS, allowing them to deposit gold ripped from the teeth of murdered Jews, valuables stolen from ghettos, cash looted from conquered nations. Under Funk, the Reichsbank became a laundromat for plunder, and standing above them all was Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal, head of the Luftwaffe and master of the 4-year plan. Göring wasn't just a military commander. He was an economic overlord, tasked by Hitler with making Germany self-sufficient for war. He ordered synthetic fuel plants, synthetic rubber, massive armaments programs, most of them expensive, many of them inefficient. Göring lived in obscene luxury, dripping with jewels and furs, while rationing bit deep into ordinary German lives. But Göring's 4-year plan had a fatal flaw. It assumed conquest. Germany didn't have enough oil, grain, or metals to sustain itself. The economy was built on the gamble that foreign lands would supply them once occupied. In 1939, that gamble began. There was another figure, darker, colder, who saw money in human life itself, Heinrich Himmler. As head of the SS, Himmler controlled the camps. To him, prisoners were not just enemies of the Reich. They were tools, assets, resources to be exploited. And when the idea of counterfeiting enemy currency emerged, it was Himmler who gave the order to use prisoners, men skilled in printing, engraving, banking as the labor force. This order birthed one of the strangest chapters in financial history, Operation Bernhard. It was conceived by an SS officer named Bernhard Kruger. A methodical man, precise to the point of obsession, Kruger was tasked with assembling a team of experts inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp. His orders were clear: produce counterfeit British pounds so perfect they could pass undetected in London banks. And so, behind the electrified fences, a secret workshop took shape. The prisoners chosen for this job were not ordinary laborers. They were printers, engravers, artists, forgers, even bankers. Men like Salomon Smolyanov, a Russian Jewish counterfeiter who had once lived by forging passports and currency across Europe. For men like him, the camp offered a cruel paradox. Their skill at faking money became their ticket to survival. Each prisoner lived under the shadow of a simple truth: succeed, and they lived another day. Fail, and they would be shot. In this twisted economy of the camps, the SS had created the perfect metaphor for the Reich itself, a system where human lives were just another form of currency, spent and discarded at will. The characters were now in place: a failed banker cast aside, a loyal Nazi bureaucrat willing to launder gold torn from corpses, a gluttonous Reichsmarshal spending wealth faster than it could be stolen, an SS chief turning men into machines, and in the center of it, a group of prisoners forced to create the greatest forgery in history. But how could a handful of starving men, locked behind barbed wire, hope to counterfeit the currency of the most powerful empire on earth? The answer lies in the workshop of Sachsenhausen, where ink, paper, and fear mixed into a weapon designed to bring Britain to its knees. Behind the gates of Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin, life usually meant hunger, disease, and death. But in 1942, a select group of prisoners found themselves pulled from the misery of the barracks and led into a separate building, sealed off from the rest of the camp. The SS guards told them little. What awaited inside was not gas chambers or punishment blocks, but something stranger: a print shop. Clean, organized, humming with equipment, presses, inks, stacks of paper. To men who had seen nothing but brutality, it felt almost surreal. This was the workshop of Operation Bernhard, one of the most secret projects of the entire war. The mastermind, SS Major Bernhard Kruger ran the operation with cold precision. He handpicked around 140 prisoners, men whose backgrounds set them apart. Typographers, engravers, artists, printers, even a few bankers familiar with the inner workings of financial systems. Many were Jewish, plucked from death row, their survival now tied to their usefulness. Kruger understood something his superiors did not. To create perfect forgeries, he needed experts. And to keep experts alive, he had to treat them better than the average prisoner. Inside the workshop, the men were given cleaner clothes, extra rations, even cigarettes. Luxuries unthinkable elsewhere in Sachsenhausen. For a prisoner, this was life itself, but survival carried its own torment. Each man knew he was keeping the Nazi machine alive. Some believed success might prolong their lives. Others whispered that failure would mean death anyway. It was a moral battlefield as much as a technical one. The task itself seemed impossible. The British pound was the strongest currency in the world, backed by an empire that spanned the globe. Its notes were intricate, engraved with patterns almost impossible to reproduce, printed on paper with unique fibers, watermarks and dyes. To counterfeit it was a challenge that had defeated forgers for decades. And yet, in that sealed workshop, the prisoners achieved it. They studied real notes smuggled in by German intelligence. They tested papers, inks, printing plates. Errors meant punishment. Accuracy meant another day alive. Slowly, painfully, they perfected the process. By 1943, the first flawless British £5 notes emerged from the presses, so perfect that even Bank of England experts struggled to tell real from fake. The SS were ecstatic. Himmler saw it as a weapon of war, a way to flood Britain with counterfeit money, sparking inflation and chaos. Soon the operation scaled up. The workshop produced not just £5 notes, but tens, 20s, even the elusive 50. Each note carried serial numbers carefully matched to real Bank of England issues, making them nearly impossible to detect. At full capacity, the prisoners produced over £1 million a month. Stacks of cash piled high in crates, guarded as if they were treasure. But here's the irony, the money never truly reached its target. The idea of parachuting counterfeit notes over London, of breaking the British economy from within, remained mostly fantasy. Instead, the SS used the forged currency to finance espionage, bribe informants, and purchase goods on the black market. In neutral nations like Switzerland and Turkey, these notes bought equipment, information, and influence. For the prisoners, each sheet of forged paper was both a death sentence and a lifeline. They were kept alive because they were useful, but the moment the operation ended, they knew too well what their fate would be. Some prisoners found small acts of resistance. They whispered about deliberate mistakes, notes subtly flawed, tiny details that could betray the forgery if discovered. But sabotage was deadly risky. One wrong move, one exposed trick, and the SS would execute them all. So they continued day after day, printing the wealth of an empire they would never see. In the workshop, time blurred. Outside, the war raged on. Stalingrad, Kursk, Allied bombings flattening German cities. Inside, men inked plates and checked watermarks, their lives balanced on the edge of each sheet of paper. By 1944, Operation Bernhard had created what many experts still call the greatest counterfeiting effort in history. The Bank of England itself later admitted the Nazi forgeries were nearly undetectable. And yet, in this perfection lay futility. Because while the prisoners crafted flawless money, the Reichsmark back in Germany was collapsing. People trusted cigarettes more than Hitler's paper. The Nazis could counterfeit the world's most powerful currency, but they could not save their own. Still, the operation rolled on, feeding the SS's fantasies of financial warfare. But as the war turned against Germany, the question shifted. What would happen to the counterfeiters themselves once their task was complete? That answer would come in the final months of the war, when the Reich no longer needed paper, but only silence. Stacks of counterfeit notes left Sachsenhausen in wooden crates, marked and sealed under SS authority. They were treated like weapons, because that's exactly what they were meant to be. The Nazis dreamed big. Imagine millions of fake banknotes parachuted over London, shopkeepers flooded with cash, banks overwhelmed, the British pound collapsing in chaos. A silent bomb detonated in the heart of the Allied economy. But Himmler's fantasy never reached the skies. German high command hesitated. The logistics were daunting, the risks enormous, and the Luftwaffe by 1943 had neither the strength nor the airspace to waste bombers on bundles of paper. So the grand scheme of economic sabotage fizzled before it began. Instead, the counterfeit pounds found a different life, one in the shadows. German intelligence saw the forged notes as a tool for espionage. Agents in neutral countries carried them across borders, laundering them through banks in Switzerland, Spain, and Turkey. Spies bought equipment, bribed officials, and paid informants with stacks of cash that looked every bit as real as those printed in London. One of the most famous episodes involved Otto Skorzeny, the SS commando who had rescued Mussolini from captivity in 1943. Skorzeny's daring raids were legendary, but few knew they were often financed by counterfeit British pounds. Behind his glamorous reputation was the quiet work of starving men in Sachsenhausen, pressing ink onto stolen paper. The counterfeit money also funded German intelligence operations abroad. In the Middle East, in neutral Portugal, even in far-off Argentina, Nazi agents carried British notes to buy influence. To local eyes, it was just sterling, the gold-backed currency of the world's empire. Who could question it? And here's where the weapon began to cut both ways, because once the forged notes started circulating, the Nazis lost control of them. Criminal networks, smugglers, and black market traders got their hands on Operation Bernhard currency. The perfect forgery became indistinguishable from the real thing, and soon counterfeit money was flooding markets everywhere. London knew something was wrong. Banks began receiving odd reports, serial numbers that didn't line up, batches of notes that raised suspicion. In 1943, the Bank of England quietly acknowledged a terrifying possibility. The Nazis were forging sterling and doing it with uncanny skill. The British government reacted with silence. Publicly, there was no admission. But behind the scenes, the bank began withdrawing older notes, especially the high-value denominations most likely to be targeted. It was an extraordinary move, an entire financial system adjusting itself to an invisible enemy, and yet Britain's economy never collapsed. The counterfeit pounds never reached critical mass. They greased the wheels of espionage, yes, but they didn't break the empire. Instead, the operation became a strange symbol of Nazi desperation. They could no longer match Allied tanks, planes, or oil, but they could counterfeit paper. It was a weapon born of weakness, not strength. For the prisoners in Sachsenhausen, the stakes remained deadly serious. Every note they produced might vanish into the pocket of a spy in Madrid or across the table of a Swiss banker. But for them, each successful print meant one more week alive. Some later recalled the bitter irony. "We were helping the Nazis fight the war, and yet that work saved our lives," one prisoner said after liberation. Another remembered staring at the finished notes, flawless, gleaming, packed in crates, and wondering how many lives had already been lost so that these pieces of paper could exist. By 1945, Operation Bernhard had produced an astonishing amount. Estimates range from 130 million to 300 million in forged currency. Adjusted for today, billions. Enough in theory to cripple nations, But the truth was harsher. By then the Reich was collapsing. Berlin was starving. Cities burned, railways bombed to rubble. The SS still clung to its counterfeit treasure. But the money was useless in a land where cigarettes and bread had more value than any banknote. The great weapon of financial warfare had become a pile of wasted paper. And as the Allies closed in, the SS faced a decision: what to do with their mountain of forged pounds. To let it fall into enemy hands would expose the operation, and so they prepared to make it vanish, consigning millions in perfect currency to fire, rivers, and even the deep waters of alpine lakes. But while the paper disappeared, the lessons of Operation Bernhard remained. It showed not only the audacity of the Reich, but its fatal misunderstanding of currency itself. Because true money is not paper, true money is trust. And by 1945, Nazi Germany had none left. On paper, the Reichsmark was still the official currency of Hitler's empire. Wages were stamped, ledgers tallied, pay packets handed out. But on the ground, in trenches, in villages, in POW camps, the Reichsmark had already died. At the front, a German soldier's pay was little more than kindling. Out in the fields of Ukraine or the ruins of Stalingrad, locals didn't care for Hitler's paper. They wanted food, cigarettes, or liquor. Those were the currencies of war. Cigarettes ruled above all. 1 cigarette could buy bread. 10 could buy boots. A carton could buy a man's loyalty or his silence. Soldiers hoarded them, traded them, fought over them. Even officers discovered that cartons of tobacco motivated their men more than any official wage slip. The letters home make it plain. In 1942, a German infantryman wrote to his wife, "We are paid, yes, but it is useless here. For a loaf of bread I would give a week's wages. Cigarettes are worth more than marks." And it wasn't just the Germans. American GIs in France carried US dollars, the strongest currency on earth. But when dealing with civilians, it wasn't greenbacks that won goodwill. It was Hershey's chocolate bars, Lucky Strike cigarettes, nylon stockings, small luxuries that meant life, joy, or survival in a shattered world. In prisoner of war camps, the economy turned brutal. Red Cross parcels arrived with food, soap, and cigarettes. Those items became more valuable than gold. A chocolate bar could be traded for extra bread. Soap, precious and rare, could buy protection or favors. Cigarettes were the true coin of the realm. They became the basis of a functioning shadow economy, more stable than any state currency. Meanwhile, back in Germany, civilians faced the same collapse of faith. Reichsmarks were handed out, but shop shelves stood empty. Ration cards mattered more. Housewives queued for hours to receive scraps of butter or sugar. Farmers preferred to trade goods privately on the black market, rather than accept money that no longer bought anything real. So the black market grew into an alternative economy. A silver ring might be swapped for potatoes, cigarettes for flour. Even heirlooms changed hands in exchange for food. What could not be bought with paper was bartered with the things that kept families alive. The irony was cruel. In Sachsenhausen, prisoners were forging perfect British pounds, millions of them, notes that fooled bankers across Europe. Yet inside the Reich, its own citizens were abandoning Hitler's money. The Nazis could produce paper, but they couldn't produce trust. And trust is the true foundation of currency. The Wehrmacht's conquests only worsened the problem. In occupied territories, German soldiers discovered locals refused Reichsmarks outright. Farmers and traders wanted goods, not paper. Sometimes soldiers traded honestly. Rations, boots, schnapps. More often, they took what they wanted by force. In both cases, the Reichsmark's weakness was clear. Beyond Germany's borders, it meant nothing. The contrast with the Allies was glaring. American dollars were welcome, even prized. When the U.S. Army moved through Europe, their money carried weight because it was backed by a living economy, not a dying one. A French farmer might distrust a German soldier's mark, but he trusted a GI's dollar, or better yet, the chocolate and cigarettes in his pack. By 1944, jokes spread in the Wehrmacht. Reichsmarks were good for wallpaper or for starting fires in the winter. In some towns, that was exactly what people did. The official currency of the Reich had become a punchline in its own empire. That collapse of confidence mattered more than the forged pounds, more than Himmler's dreams of financial sabotage. A nation whose people no longer believe in its money is already rotting from the inside. And as the war ground on, that rot became impossible to hide. By 1943, Germany was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation eating itself alive. The facade still stood. Shops displayed prices in Reichsmarks. Banks opened. Pay packets were distributed. But underneath, the system was collapsing. The currency was little more than paper, floating on a tide of shortages, rationing, and theft. Occupied Europe saw it first. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, German occupation authorities pumped Reichsmarks into circulation. On paper, it meant the locals were paid for goods and services. In reality, it was robbery in slow motion. Inflation soared, black markets thrived, and ordinary people learned quickly. Hitler's money was worthless. Farmers hoarded their produce. Shopkeepers quietly refused Reichsmarks, taking cigarettes, alcohol, or foreign currency instead. In Warsaw, one witness later recalled, "The Reichsmark was like dust. We preferred Russian rubles, American dollars, anything but German money." By late 1943, even German soldiers noticed their pay bought nothing. In occupied Paris, a Wehrmacht private complained that French black marketeers wouldn't take his Reichsmarks. They wanted gold, jewelry, or US dollars. Some soldiers sent their wages home untouched, knowing the money was useless where they stood. Inside Germany, the picture wasn't better. Allied bombers reduced cities to rubble. Railroads faltered, factories shut down, and the rationing system stretched to breaking point. Housewives queued for hours for scraps of meat, while the shelves behind them emptied. The Reichsmark might say 10, but in practice it bought nothing at all. The real economy shifted underground. Cigarettes became the standard unit of trade. Soap, liquor, even stockings took on the role of currency. Ordinary Germans joked grimly that the mark is for show, the cigarette is for life. The Reich's leaders knew the truth, though they rarely said it aloud. Himmler's counterfeit operation had not broken Britain, but Britain's blockade and relentless bombing were strangling Germany. The Nazi regime responded the only way it knew, by looting gold, art, livestock, machinery. Whatever could be seized from occupied lands was shipped back to Germany. Trains left Paris and Warsaw not just with soldiers, but with entire economies stripped bare. It was wealth without trust, plunder without permanence. The Reichsbank's vaults swelled with gold taken from conquered nations and from the teeth and jewelry of murdered Jews in the camps. On paper, Germany looked rich, but it was a grotesque illusion. Real wealth, the kind that sustains an economy, is food, fuel, industry, and trust. And those were running out. By 1944, the cracks were undeniable. German civilians whispered that their savings were meaningless. Rationing turned bitter, corruption flourished, and the gap between the official story and lived reality grew impossible to ignore. For many, the breaking point came when the Reich began forcing occupied nations to accept Reichsmarks by decree. It was economic violence dressed as policy, but people resisted in quiet, practical ways. Farmers hid their crops, traders demanded barter. Entire villages carried on in defiance, refusing Hitler's paper even at gunpoint. That refusal mattered more than any Allied bomb. It was proof that the Nazi system had lost its last weapon, credibility. The Reichsmark had become what economists call soft currency, Money no one wants, even when forced. And once a currency loses its legitimacy, it cannot be revived with threats. It becomes a symbol not of power but of decline. The irony was sharp. While Britain defended its pound against Nazi forgeries, it was Germany's own money that collapsed from within. Operation Bernhard had been a dream of sabotage, but the Reich sabotaged itself instead. By the end of 1944, every soldier, every housewife, every child in the Reich understood it. Money was supposed to mean security. But in Hitler's Germany, survival had no price tag. Bread mattered more than marks, cigarettes more than savings, a quiet barter in the ruins more than a full purse at the bank. The turning point had come. The Reich could still kill, still terrorize, still fight, but it could no longer pay. And that failure cut deeper than bombs. While soldiers bartered for bread and housewives traded soap for potatoes, another world existed, far from the front lines, the world of numbers, ledgers, and vaults. Here on the surface, the Reich appeared strong. In Berlin, the Reichsbank boasted mountains of wealth, gold bars stacked high, foreign currencies piled in crates, precious art and jewels catalogued and locked away. A steady stream of loot flowed in from occupied Europe. French francs, Dutch guilders, Belgian gold, Czech machinery. The Reich looked on paper like a financial juggernaut, and then there was the greatest secret stockpile of all, the counterfeit pounds. By 1943, Operation Bernhard was working at terrifying efficiency. The printing presses inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp ran day and night, their Jewish prisoners forced to replicate every detail of the British pound. The results were almost flawless. Even London's own bank struggled to detect the fakes. Over £132 million in counterfeit notes were produced. Adjusted for today, that's billions of dollars. If stacked together, the notes could have filled entire train cars. The scheme was so vast it became the largest counterfeiting operation in history. And yet, what did all that paper mean? Very little. The Nazis funneled some of it into the world. Bundles of counterfeit pounds were laundered through neutral countries like Switzerland and Turkey, exchanged for goods or hard currency. Spies used it to finance operations. Black marketeers moved it quietly through occupied Europe. But the dream of flooding Britain itself never came. Dropping fake banknotes from aircraft was discussed, tested, even seriously planned, but never executed. By the time production reached its peak, Germany had lost air supremacy. The RAF ruled the skies. The Luftwaffe could no longer even bomb London reliably, let alone scatter millions of counterfeit notes across the island. And so, the forged money piled higher and higher. Vast crates of it were hidden in salt mines, buried in forests, sunk in alpine lakes as the Reich collapsed. What Operation Bernhard revealed was a paradox. The Nazis had perfected the art of printing money. They could produce more paper pounds than Britain itself. But they could not turn paper into trust. Real power in war came not from stacks of counterfeit notes, but from stable production, factories, farms, and oil fields. In that arena, Germany was falling behind fast. By 1944, Allied industry had outproduced the Reich on every front. The United States alone dwarfed German capacity. Its factories poured out tanks, aircraft, trucks, rifles, ships, all backed by a dollar as solid as steel. Britain, though battered, kept its economy afloat, its pound intact, its credit respected. Meanwhile, Germany's production figures told a story of desperation. Oil shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Synthetic fuel plants were bombed into ruins. Steel was scarce, labor scarcer. The Reich turned to slave labor, dragging millions into its war machine. Even then, the numbers did not add up. For every German tank, the Allies built 5. For every Reichsmark printed, its purchasing power slipped further into the abyss. The counterfeit notes, for all their brilliance, were symbolic of the Reich itself, vast in scale, dazzling in design but hollow at the core. In the end, much of Bernhard's fortune never left storage. In 1945, as Allied troops closed in, SS men dumped crates of forged pounds into Austria's Lake Toplitz. Divers would discover them decades later, soggy but intact, the ghost of a weapon that had never been fired. For the prisoners who printed them, the operation was a grim gamble for survival. Skilled printers and engravers, men who had once worked in banks and mints, now worked under threat of death. As long as their skills were useful, they lived. When their usefulness ended, they feared they would be executed. One prisoner recalled later, "Each perfect note we made was another day of life. We survived because we were useful, nothing more." The Reich had conjured billions in paper wealth, but it could not conjure victory. In the cold light of 1944, production numbers no longer mattered. The Allies had already won the economic war. The counterfeit pounds became not a weapon, but a monument to futility. Numbers tell one story, people tell another, and when a currency collapses, it is not bankers who feel it first. It is soldiers, prisoners, and mothers trying to feed their children. Inside Sachsenhausen, the men of Operation Bernhard lived this truth in the most twisted way imaginable. They were counterfeiters forced to counterfeit. Most were Jews, pulled from transports bound for Auschwitz and death. They were spared, but only to produce false British pounds for the Reich. One survivor remembered the moment he was selected. They asked what I had done before the war. I said I was a printer. The officer smiled. That smile kept me alive. The Bernhard prisoners were kept apart from the main camp. They had cleaner barracks, more food, even radios. But the privilege was poisoned. They knew why they were alive. Their usefulness was their only shield. Each perfect forgery kept the presses and their hearts beating. One man later said, "Every note I printed was another day I cheated death. I thought if I fail, I die. If I succeed, I am helping the Nazis." There was no way to win. The counterfeiter's dilemma echoed across the Reich. Ordinary people were trapped in a system where money meant nothing. Yet survival still carried a price. Letters from German civilians show how faith in the Reichsmark crumbled. A housewife in Hamburg wrote to her sister in 1944, "I have 10 marks in my purse, but the baker has no bread. What is money if it cannot feed a child?" In Berlin, black market traders set up in alleyways and bombed out ruins. Their tables were not covered with coins or banknotes, but with soap, butter, cigarettes, stockings. People carried rings, watches, family silver, heirlooms traded away for bread. The Reichsmark was still legal tender, but trust had moved elsewhere. For soldiers, the collapse of money meant an endless hunger. Diaries from the Eastern Front tell of men trading watches for food, boots for shelter. One Wehrmacht officer confessed, "I carry marks, but the peasants laugh. They ask for cigarettes or they want potatoes. They say our money will die with us." In POW camps, the economy hardened into rules more ruthless than any bank. Cigarettes were currency, yes, but not equally. A man with Red Cross parcels grew rich. A man without them starved. Some traded fairly. Others exploited desperation. Economies grow cruel when survival is the only measure. And yet even in these bleak markets there was humanity. Prisoners shared food with the weakest. Neighbors bartered without profit, just to help. The death of one currency gave birth to another, built not only on scarcity but on solidarity. The Allied side knew the story too. American soldiers wrote home not about marks or francs, but about barter. One GI described entering a French village. The children wanted chocolate. The women asked for stockings, the men asked for cigarettes. No one asked for money. And still, through it all, the Nazis clung to their delusions of paper power. The Reichsbank's vaults were guarded, filled with looted gold and fake pounds. But for the people in the streets, those vaults were irrelevant. A nation cannot eat bullion. A child cannot chew counterfeit notes. Perhaps the most haunting symbol of this truth came at war's end. As the Reich collapsed in 1945, crates of counterfeit pounds were loaded into trucks and dumped into Austria's Lake Toplitz. SS men heaved them overboard, billions in false wealth sinking beneath the dark water. For the prisoners of Operation Bernhard, liberation came days later. Some survived, scarred but alive. They had lived because they could create the illusion of money. But in the ruins around them, the illusion was already gone. The Reichsmark had failed. The counterfeit pound had failed. And the people who lived through it understood. When money dies, it leaves not just poverty, but a kind of silence, a hollow where trust used to be. These were not just economic failures. They were human tragedies, measured not in inflation charts, but in empty bellies and broken lives. And as the Reich staggered into its final year, that failure had consequences far beyond hunger. It was now shaping the war itself. Wars are not only fought with bullets and bombs. They are fought with ledgers, supply chains, and balance sheets. And by 1944, Germany's financial system was bleeding out. The Reichsmark was the nervous system of Hitler's empire. But when it failed, everything else began to seize. For the Wehrmacht, the most obvious consequence was logistics. Armies march on supplies, food, fuel, ammunition. And supplies are bought, bargained for, or stolen. In the early years, the Reichsmark gave a veneer of legitimacy to looting. German soldiers could hand over banknotes, requisitioning goods in occupied France or Belgium under the guise of payment. But once those notes were refused, the mask slipped. Occupation became naked theft. Farmers hid their produce. Villagers resisted. Entire communities went underground rather than trade with worthless marks. Every loaf of bread the Wehrmacht needed had to be pried out by force, tying down manpower, spreading resentment, and fueling resistance. This had a direct military cost. Every division bogged down in guarding convoys or seizing grain was a division not fighting on the front. Every partisan ambush on supply routes was fed by hatred of the Reich's economic predation. Strategically, the counterfeit pounds of Operation Bernhard became a cruel mirror. They showed that the Nazis understood currency as a weapon, but they wielded it clumsily. Britain defended its pound not only with banking vigilance, but with credibility. The pound was still trusted in Cairo, in Delhi and New York. The Reichsmark, meanwhile, rotted even in Berlin. Hitler's generals saw the problem but could not solve it. They asked for more tanks, more fuel, more men, but the Reich could no longer pay. Foreign suppliers, neutral nations like Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, began demanding gold or dollars instead of Reichsmarks. The Nazis were forced to drain their looted reserves of bullion just to keep trade alive. Each shipment of tungsten from Spain or ball bearings from Sweden carried a hidden cost. Another slice of the Reich's treasure hoard sold off. Another sign that its own currency was dead. At home, inflation eroded morale. Ordinary Germans saw their savings vanish in real terms. Workers understood that wages were meaningless without goods to buy. The black market became not just an alternative, but the only functioning economy. This hollowed out faith in the regime itself. A nation that cannot feed its people, that cannot sustain the value of its own money, cannot inspire loyalty for long. By 1944, Germany was paying its soldiers in marks that no one wanted, feeding them with rations stripped from occupied lands, and fueling its army with oil bought not with trust, but with stolen gold. It was a war machine running on fumes. The contrast with the Allies was brutal. The United States poured out weapons in numbers the Reich could never match, backed by the dollar, a currency so strong that soldiers could use it freely across the globe. Britain, though battered, kept its pound alive and with it its access to global credit. The Soviet Union endured unimaginable suffering, but it had resources, manpower, and Allied support. Germany had none of these. The Reich's economic collapse was not just a symptom of defeat. It accelerated defeat. Without a functioning currency, the Nazi state had to govern through plunder and terror alone. And terror has limits. It breeds enemies faster than it sustains an army. Operation Bernhard, in hindsight, looks like a desperate act of projection. The Nazis tried to shatter Britain's trust in money, but they could not preserve their own. They imagined collapsing the pound, but it was the Reichsmark that fell first, dragging with it the empire it was meant to fund. By the end of 1944, the Reich could still kill, still destroy, still resist, but it could not pay, could not trade, could not sustain. The Reichsmark had become a ghost currency, moving through ledgers but absent from life. And in that absence, the war was already lost. When Berlin fell in May 1945, Allied soldiers walked through streets littered with rubble, ration cards, and banknotes. The Reichsmark was everywhere, stuffed in wallets, blowing in the wind, hoarded in mattresses. But it was as dead as the regime that printed it. Germany was a nation stripped of trust. Its banks had collapsed, its savings were ash, its currency had no meaning. Soldiers returning home brought pay that could not buy bread. Families sat on piles of worthless paper while children scavenged for food. The Allies understood immediately. If they wanted to rebuild Europe, they had to rebuild money first. In the Western zones of occupation, US dollars became the default currency. Cigarettes remained the unofficial medium of exchange. Traded openly in markets, but beneath the chaos, plans for something larger took shape. In 1948, the Deutsche Mark was introduced in West Germany. Overnight, the old Reichsmark was demonetized. People lined up at exchange stations, trading in their useless paper for a fresh currency, backed not by ideology, but by the promise of stability and American support. Almost instantly, shop shelves filled again. Goods hidden away during years of black marketeering returned to the light. Trust had been reborn, not through fear but through credibility. The lesson was clear. Currency lives or dies on belief. Hitler's Reichsmark died because it was propped up by lies, by looting, by violence. The Deutsche Mark thrived because people believed in it, and in the system that stood behind it. The echoes of Operation Bernhard stretched long after the war. In 1959, divers searching Austria's Lake Toplitz uncovered crates of soggy counterfeit pounds, the remnants of the Nazi plot. Journalists swarmed, treasure hunters followed, and the story of the great forgery entered legend. It became a dark parable. The empire that tried to destroy another nation's currency drowned in the ruins of its own. But the deeper legacy was global. The Second World War proved beyond doubt that money as a weapon as real as any rifle. The Allies won not only because they fought harder, but because their currencies held stronger. The US dollar emerged from the war as the cornerstone of the world economy, its stability guaranteed by America's unmatched industrial output and untouched homeland. By 1944, even before the war ended, Allied leaders met at Bretton Woods to design a new financial order. They created the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a system where the US dollar became the anchor of global trade. The pound sterling survived but was humbled. The Reichsmark was gone, replaced first by Allied scrip, then by the Deutsche Mark. Germany's post-war recovery, the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, was built not only on Marshall Plan aid, but on the hard lesson of trust. Germans had seen what happened when a state looted its own economy and destroyed its currency. They embraced stability, discipline, and credibility as the foundation of a new system. In a sense, Hitler lost the war long before the Soviets entered Berlin or the Americans crossed the Rhine. He lost it when the Reichsmark lost its value, when German civilians turned to barter, when farmers laughed at soldiers offering paper, when the very idea of money under the swastika collapsed. A regime that cannot pay its people cannot last. The collapse of Nazi currency revealed something profound, that war is not only a clash of armies, but a clash of systems of trust. The Allies had dollars and pounds that people believed in. The Nazis had marks and forgeries that nobody trusted. That difference, more than any single battle, decided the fate of the Reich. And so the counterfeit notes at the bottom of Lake Toplitz remain not just relics, but symbols. Symbols of a grand illusion, of a regime that thought power could be faked, wealth could be stolen, trust could be forced. In the end, it all dissolved in water. Wars are remembered in images. Tanks rolling through mud, cities burning under bombs, soldiers clutching rifles in the dark. But history often hides its sharpest weapons in quieter places, in ledgers, in vaults, in the fragile paper promises we call money. The story of the Reichsmark is not just a tale of Nazi economics, it is a reminder of what war really consumes. Not only lives and land, but trust itself. For Hitler's empire, the Reichsmark was meant to be proof of permanence, a symbol of the 1,000-year Reich, stamped with eagles and swastikas, carried by soldiers across a continent. But the truth was simpler, harsher. It was paper backed by plunder. And when the plunder ran dry, the paper turned to dust. Operation Bernhard, the great counterfeit scheme, revealed the irony at the heart of Nazi power. They tried to destroy the pound sterling with forgeries so perfect that they fooled banks, traders, even experts. Yet while the pound endured, it was the Reichsmark that collapsed. Britain's money survived because the world still trusted it. Germany's failed because no one trusted the Reich. In the end, German civilians sat in their ruined homes surrounded by worthless notes. Occupied nations rejected the Reichsmark with contempt. Soldiers tried to buy bread with paper that wasn't worth kindling. The war machine that once terrified the world was reduced to bartering, stealing, and begging. That collapse carried a quiet lesson. Bombs and bullets can kill, but only trust sustains. Trust is what fills shop shelves. Trust is what convinces a farmer to trade his grain. Trust is what lets a soldier's wages feed his family. And when trust dies, nations die with it. The Allied victory was measured not only in battlefields taken, but in currencies preserved. The pound battered but alive, the dollar ascendant and untouchable, the ruble propped by sacrifice and Soviet steel, and against them the Reichsmark, hollow, broken, abandoned. After the war, when Germany rebuilt, it was not tanks or planes that restored its future. It was the creation of a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, a piece of paper that carried not fear but credibility. With it came stability, recovery, and eventually prosperity. The lesson was not forgotten. Trust is the foundation of power. And today, when we talk of wars, trade wars, cyber wars, conflicts fought not with soldiers, but with sanctions and markets, the echo of the Reichsmark's collapse still lingers. Currency remains a battlefield. Confidence remains a weapon. And history reminds us, the side that holds the world's trust will always outlast the side that rules by fear. So when we think of the Third Reich, we think of its armies, its atrocities, its collapse in fire. But beneath it all was something quieter, almost invisible. The slow death of a currency that was never truly alive. The Reichsmark did not just lose value. It revealed the lie at the heart of Hitler's empire, a regime that promised eternity but could not pay for tomorrow. In the ruins of Berlin, children played with stacks of useless banknotes, scattering them like confetti in streets of rubble. That image, under not of power but of emptiness, is the true epitaph of the Reich, and perhaps that is where this story should end, with the silence after the storm, with paper drifting on the wind, with a currency that once sought to rule a continent, now fit only to burn. The Reichsmark's final ledger was not written in numbers, but in ashes. In the end, the Reich's final weapon wasn't a tank or a bomb. It was paper, ink, greed. The same machinery that built their lies and printed their downfall. History remembers the victors. But it's the forgotten details and the quiet crimes that define who we really were. If you stand for remembering what others tried to erase, subscribe, share this story, and keep history alive. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember.